Welcome, everybody, to Misguided, the podcast, where we explore how misinformation spreads and what we can do about it. I'm your host, Matthew Facciani, and today I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Cecilie Steenbuch-Traberg, a psychologist whose path into this field took a fascinating detour through marketing before she found her true calling, not persuading people, but protecting them from being persuaded. Cecilia completed her PhD under Sander van der Linden at Cambridge, where she evaluated whether classic pre-bunking intervention, the games and tools designed to inoculate people against misinformation, actually hold up in the messy social reality of how we encounter false information online. Cecilia is now a professor at the Copenhagen Business School, where she investigates the psychology of social influence in the digital age. In this conversation, dig into her journey into studying social influence, her new pre-bunking game, Solomon's Secret, a murder mystery designed to teach social influence literacy without ever even mentioning misinformation. And we talk about why reaching people who don't think they're susceptible is one of the hardest and most important challenges in this space. We also get into how artificial intelligence is reshaping how we navigate misinformation online, but also provides an opportunity for scalable, personalized interventions. This is a wide-ranging and thoughtful conversation, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I did. Let's get into it. Cecilia, thank you so much for joining me on my podcast today. I'm really excited to learn about all the cool things that you've been doing over the past few years. And before we kind of jump into what you've been doing lately, I was curious if you could share with my listeners how you got interested in this topic of misinformation and the psychology of belief. Just kind of share a little bit about your journey into how you came to be where you are today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be on your podcast. And yes, of course. So I think in a way, my route into studying misinformation and interventions to reduce susceptibility to misinformation is a bit of a opposite route that most people take. Initially, I studied marketing and psychology, but more seeing psychology as a way to kind of inform marketing. And when I was going to go out and work with marketing I did all my kind of early bachelor year internships with marketing firms and conducting market research, and my part-time jobs were in marketing, etc. And I liked marketing because it was all about understanding what is it that influences people to buy into a certain message, to purchase certain products, to align with certain ideas, etc. But the more I started kind of looking into the field of working in marketing, the less I could kind of see myself within those roles. I found that it was really hard to find companies where I thought I would really want to sell this message and I could really stand by this message. Um, and I had also at the same time gotten really interested in just the human mind in general and under what conditions we're kind of persuaded by certain messages and what is it that kind of goes on in our brains when we decide that something must be reliable or true or changes our attitudes towards something that we previously liked and now dislike, or the opposite. And then after a master's in social cognition, where I kind of got to dive more deeply into the kind of biological and neuroscience side of the brain to better understand what's going on there from an influence perspective, I came across Sander van der Linden's work, who became my PhD supervisor. And that his work was kind of the first time that I read any papers or research looking at the opposite side. So not just how we could persuade people or influence people, but actually how we could prevent them from being influenced in the first place. And I thought that was such a unique way to kind of flip psychology and almost marketing around.
Mm-hmm.
And it really became one of those things where I thought this is really a path that I can see myself stand by, and that reflects my values, where I'm not trying to persuade people to do something that they didn't want to do before, or buy something or buy into a message, but rather I'm trying to protect their minds against influence. And I also thought that was a kind of a unique way to apply all the insights that I had learned about how to really kind of play tricks on the mind, but then reverse them. Um, and then one of the main areas in which I think it is important that it has been applied is misinformation. So how can we protect people's minds against misinformation? But then I've also since delved into protecting people against misleading advertisements, etc. So kind of flipping the coin around. And yeah, that's kind of how I got into it.
Yeah, I mean, that's cool that you ended up kind of full circle, starting out in marketing and then trying to pre-bunk against some of these misleading marketing tactics.
Yes.
That's a fun journey. I'm curious what kinds of pre-bunking games or media literacy games you've dove into because I know you've published a few different studies on this. And when I was looking at your website, you had another game, I think what was it, Solomon's Secret on there. I was curious if you just talk more about these types of pre-bunking games, like how do they work and what have you found when people play them?
Yeah, so you could say with like the classic pre-bunking games, they tend to be in a kind of like short-term game environment in which people are given a very kind of clear mission. For example, in the bad news game, they're basically put in the shoes of a misinformation producer and asked to and learn by doing. So they learn about how to persuade people and how to mislead people via misinformation using different strategies, and they kind of need to build up their credibility while spreading misinformation. So of course you won't have any impact on people if you spread misinformation but they later don't think that you're credible at all. So it's all about how can you use different strategies to mislead people while kind of maintaining a level of perceived credibility. And with these games, so I haven't been part of developing the games myself, but I've been part of testing them in multiple different contexts because as a researcher, I'm really interested in context and kind of seeing whether or not classic interventions that are developed kind of just on the individual level work when we're kind of situated within a social context where there are so many other variables at play than just the information itself. So this is why I became interested in testing some of these tried and tested interventions that kind of work in a classic lab setting and seeing whether or not they work in conditions where people are receiving misinformation from, let's say, political in-groups, or they're seeing misinformation in a context where all the other social cues indicate that the group believes misinformation. And the way we basically test that is kind of re-engineering the process of the intervention. So in the classic intervention setup, you'd have either people rate a series of headlines before they play the game, and then rate a series of headlines afterwards so that we can see whether on an individual level they have improved. Or we would take the game and compare people who play the game to people who play a random other game to see whether or not people who played the game are significantly better than people who don't play the game. And so what I have done in my research is put people in different groups alongside those game groups to test whether or not there is a difference in the improvement if the misinformation is from your in-group or out-group, or if you see persuasive social cues alongside the information or not. And you could say with that research, what we generally find is that the games do seem to work under these conditions. However, people who are quote unquote inoculated or receive the intervention are still susceptible to all these cues. So it's not as if those intervention games actually protect against the contextual effects themselves, indicating that we need more tailored interventions that don't just teach people about the information, but teach them about the context as well, if we want people to improve within these contexts as well, that are more representative of the real social world, you could say.
Yeah, that's great. And that connects to some of my work that I was doing at Notre Dame, where we compared our media literacy game that was designed for an Indonesian audience to Harmony Square. We actually just
Yeah.
got that out last week. It's finally published.
Okay,
So
congrats.
yeah, so it was cool to look at that and see. Basically, we found that we could replicate the Harmony Square result in the U.S., but when we translated Harmony Square for an Indonesian audience, it didn't work at all. So we
Yeah,
got complete null effects.
exactly.
Yeah, so I'd be curious if you talk a little bit more about like these source effects of when someone's reading a fact check or some type of pre-bunking information, how exactly are they processing it? Like what seems to resonate more? Is it if you see it's directly from the same group and they see that connected, or are there certain cues that people look for that really have been able to be identified in your research?
Yeah, so I've definitely found in my research that there are clear source effects. So when the information is the same, then people are much more likely to believe misinformation that's not political at all when it comes from a politically aligned news source. And this
Hmm.
holds true for both media news sources that people know, that are well known, but also fictitious kind of made up sources that they have never heard of. before, indicating that it's not, specific sources themselves just, it's also the general idea that a source holds your political opinion, which also means that this is likely also at play in general when we view news and information online, that it's not just what the source has said in the past and whether or not it aligns with my political beliefs, but it's also whether or not I generally perceive that source to be politically aligned with me. And what we find in the research is also that that similarity effect is driving your perception of the source's credibility, which in turn is what kind of makes you more likely to be persuaded. So when we see a source that's more similar to us, this makes us think that the source must be more credible, and therefore we think that its information is more likely to be true. I think what's quite remarkable is that we see this for information that has nothing to do with politics, indicating that when the information does have to do with politics, there is likely kind of an add-on effect because there are clear differences in how people evaluate, of course, politically aligned information itself with politically disaligned and misinformation. And so the source effect becomes this kind of add-on effect that holds true for both non-political and political information itself. And
Interesting.
yeah, I was just going to say that with the flip side, we also see that cues that have nothing to do with politics or sources, but are rather more social, indicating what a general group believes, also impacts our likelihood of falling for misinformation. So this could be via whatever people comment on social media. It kind of suggests that they believe the headline. If it has more likes, if we're simply told that other people believe this information, we're more likely to believe it ourselves as well. And that we find is psychologically, at least in part, mediated via this perceived consensus. So basically, if we're exposed to kind of local social cues within a closed environment, this could be, for example, 5 social media comments. This leads us to assume that whatever we're seeing on our platform is kind of a generally held belief or a generally held judgment of this information, and in turn this leads us to kind of to be more likely to believe it ourselves, which is quite scary because it means that you don't have to see very much social information for you to assume that it is a widely held misbelief. Or yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That low threshold of social consensus, especially on social media, and we know that could be artificially constructed. You can create a few different bots that sound pretty convincing, and just feels like a lot of people you're interacting with. If you get 10, 20 likes or comments on a post, that seems like a lot, even though it might only be a tiny fraction of people who believe that certain thing. And especially if it's, hundreds or thousands of likes or comments, and that still could be a very minority position overall. But as we see those notifications pop up, it can make us really feel like a lot of people support that particular belief.
hmm Yeah, and I think also that's also what, so to your question earlier about Solomon's Secret, this is what kind of motivated me to try to create a new game that's not necessarily about the information itself, but that is about the social context. So basically, I was part of this program at an arts university in London where it was a 1 year fellowship where we were a bunch of academics and artists uh, who were put together in a group and asked to come up with projects that targeted misinformation and creating social change using creative methods. So basically, via a lot of mentoring and sparring and talking with game designers and artists and creatives, etc., I came up with the idea of creating something that wasn't an on-the-nose misinformation game. Because from a lot of both the research itself, seeing what kind of demographics these games were reaching when they were available to everyone who had access to the internet, we were seeing that people were quite highly educated. They had pretty low bar for misinformation susceptibility in general compared to the general public. Whenever I would go give talks or go to panels or talk with colleagues outside of this field, they would always say, but aren't you just reaching, are you preaching to the choir?
Hmm.
Aren't you just reaching the people who already care about misinformation? How are you going to reach those people who don't know that they're susceptible and they don't care even if they are?
Hmm.
And I think this is a real problem. So I came up with an idea of creating a game that's not about misinformation at all, at least directly, but
Hmm.
it is indirectly. And so basically, the idea is that it is a murder mystery game in which you are tasked with solving this murder mystery and finding out kind of who done it. Um, and by doing that, you have to collect clues and talk with different other people. And there are mechanisms in the game that kind of simulate people trying to persuade you using misinformation tactics. And you might be persuaded by like the group. You might have your influence, your judgment influenced by others. And the idea is to try to kind of see through other people's lies. And we're trying to kind of mimic what goes on social media and the different strategies that people might use to kind of mislead or persuade you and embed those within different characters. And then the idea is to kind of try to resist that influence, and the game kind of the outcome changes depending on how you play, and you kind of learn about these misinformation tactics throughout the game, but without anyone directly telling you that this is like a misinformation game where we're trying to teach you this. So the aim is also to kind of aim it at Generation Z, who by some research are shown to be the most susceptible generation currently, and also to take it out of that misinformation environment. At the same time, I also had the opportunity to work with an organization in the UK called More in Common, which they basically try to map the political landscape in different segments rather than just looking at what party people vote for, because according to like their segmentation, there are different things that kind of characterize the different segments within the UK. And one of the ones that are kind of, at least in their research, shown to be most susceptible to misinformation are called the disengaged battlers. So this is a group who basically have lost faith in the system. They don't believe that change actually happens when you vote. They don't trust the media, they don't trust institutions, but also this might make them more likely to get information in their social circles rather than from quote unquote credible institutions. And it can leave them a bit more vulnerable to misinformation, but of course, there are good reasons for them to have this lack of trust. So we try to kind of have that audience in mind as well when developing the game, that it must not be like didactic or on the nose, and it must not be like preachy or anything like that, but it must be more learning about how you consume information in general, not what is true and what is false, or how do you evaluate like credibility using anything like institutional level as the marker of that. So we don't have yet run pre-post trials or RCTs with this game yet, because I've just received the last version basically this week. So hopefully we'll get to do some of that work soon.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to seeing those papers and what you find out. I think that's such a cool approach to helping people navigate the information environment better, and it updates it to the current digital world and ecosystem. Like you said, that people are focused on the social cues and their social groups, and understanding how those can influence us is really important. It's something that I've been talking about as like a part of media literacy, is this like social psychological literacy. It's like all kind of connected. What is like an example of a lesson that you would get from playing this game? Like, do you reflect on like your diversity among your social group and how it can influence you? Like, what are some of the main things that people take away after they play the game?
Yeah, so I mean, right now we only have like a demo, which is supposed to represent basically one chapter of what will hopefully, when we get our large grant,
Mhm.
be like a multi-chapter game. But within this first chapter, they get to reflect on what the consequences are on a strategic, emotional, practical, and social level are of dissenting against a group. So
Mm.
when a group kind of says the opposite that you say and what you believe, what are like the consequences of you going against that? And what will the pros and the cons be? To kind of learn about, okay, this might also be considerations we take on social media in general. Like, what is the likelihood actually that these three other people are correct and that I am not? Could they be all be wrong and I am right? And what kind of influence am I under here? Am I just trying to like fit into the group? How will it impact me strategically? How will it impact my relationships that I say something opposite? And how will it impact things practically? So, for example, will they turn against me? Will I lose friends? Will I, in this game, for example, end up being accused and end up in jail myself? So, are there kind of like other mechanisms at play? So they kind of learn to evaluate these aspects. In the later iterations of the game, the aim is also to have different characters represent different or embed different misinformation tactics. So you kind of learn about and you have to be able to spot what tactics they're using. But rooting these a little bit more in social influence strategies and the ways in which you might be influenced by someone, and not necessarily just the information that they say. And in the current version of the game as well, we have this credibility or trustworthiness meter, which is not an objective measure. So we try to teach people that your assessment of someone's trustworthiness and credibility is not objective, but is rather based on all your interactions with them. So as they interact with different characters within the game, this trustworthiness meter goes up and down, also depending on how many experiences you've shared in the past, whether they're aligned attitudinally with you, so whether or not they're telling you you think that they're telling you lies here and now. For example, we have this one character who is called Moxie, and she's a social media influencer. And right when the body is like kind of discovered, at some point she wants to take a selfie with the corpse and post it on social media. So like your assessment of her credibility and trustworthiness kind of goes down, but you share some experiences and you kind of get to hover over that meter to see how is this credibility made up, to also teach people that it's not like something you can just tell someone that something is credible or something is not credible, or a source is credible or it's not. It's something that everyone has a subjective opinion on, and it changes over time. But we do this in order to make people more aware of how their assessments of credibility are formed, rather than trying to tell them what is credible or not, so that they can maybe be more reflective on that in general.
And I guess the hope would be to implement this in schools. Like, how do you scale up these types of pre-bunking games? Is it
Yeah, I
just,
think
yeah,
the hope would be that it could be some a part of a school curriculum for young people, that it becomes kind of part of how they learn about information and influence in general. And so I guess in a way it's more of an influence game rather than a misinformation per se. But given that all my research is like looking at how people are influenced by misinformation, it's also related to that. So schools, but then also hopefully something that's made available like online or worldwide, so that anyone can play the game. But yeah, and then we're also hoping to kind of pair up with people within the gaming space to kind of allow people like gamers themselves to kind of come in and try play this game, and also help build on iterations of that game. So we're going to have like one of these sessions in London in a few months, where we're going to kind of try to engage with the audience and try to see what their assessment of it is, rather than um kind of have more iterations in dialogue with the audiences that we're hoping will kind of gain something from this.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a great approach. I think I wish more academics, institutions, technologists would engage with the people they're trying to reach and share their product with more broadly. I think it's really cool to see that perspective. And also, yeah, working with gaming companies. I mean, games are such a cool way to teach people because you can make it really fun and engaging and
Mhm.
social. When we think about pre-bunking games, I do wonder if there's a way to create a social element where people want to share this with their friends. Have you thought about this game or like other games, or like ways you can kind of scale it up just kind of organically with like people playing multiplayer kind of stuff? Do you think that's
Yeah,
possible?
exactly. I think that would be the dream, to create a multiplayer game eventually. But I also think that like in general, this is also what like the education and science communication space can learn from the creative world, is that, people remember things more when they were fun, and when they contained stories, and when they hit a nerve, and um, when they could really like be embedded within the stories themselves, and also when their actions changed the outcome within the game. That they had some form of autonomy, and that it wasn't overly like lecturing.
Hmm.
but that it was rather like a fun experience first. We see many examples of this in the media world in general, like with films that have major impacts on how people think about the world and injustices and crises, etc. One of the best ways currently of getting people talking is like a Netflix documentary about something,
Mm,
right? Which also
yeah.
just proves that the power of storytelling, that sometimes it can happen organically if you're able to tell a story the right way. So for science communicators and storytellers and creatives to be better at kind of coming together and crafting a message together is also something that I think that a lot of more traditional kind of pre-bunking interventions and media literacy interventions can learn from, so that the spread becomes organic by virtue of people actually having enjoyed themselves and almost learned something by accident.
Hmm.
Because people don't necessarily, for example, also turn on a Netflix documentary because they're like, I really want to learn like the ins and outs of this. They see like the initial trailer that just starts playing in front of their eyes and they're like, this looks really, there's a dilemma here. This looks really interesting. I need to know more.
Hmm.
And then they share it not because they were like, "Oh, maybe I learned so much." Maybe it's a combination of the fact that it was intriguing, it was entertaining, and then they kind of almost learned something quote unquote by accident. And I think we need more of that. And that's also try to kind of how we tried to frame this game was that it was, you know, I always told the game designers as well, we needed to be it would I would like it to be fun first, education second, that we need to make sure that people are drawn in for the fun, but they learn something at the same time. And that it is like the game mechanics are rooted in the science or the psychology of misinformation, but they don't directly represent it. It's a symbolic element within that. Yeah, and I think that that's like at least a new kind of wave of looking at science communication and pre-bunking.
Yeah, I think so too. And I hope more people dive into that approach. I think it connects with a lot of the research showing how social these processes are for believing things that are not true. And if you can kind of take a step back and be like, well, how do we even learn how social influence works? And you can teach that in a fun way, then it preempts all the misinformation stuff. It's just like, how do you become a more thoughtful consumer of anything?
Yeah. And also by like embedding people within the process themselves so that they're almost like they experience the process of being influenced within the kind of safe environment
Hmm.
before they kind of go into the real world and potentially are affected by these. I imagine, I don't know if you know, you probably do know the famous Ash experiment with the lion task,
Yeah.
where people are where they had a bunch of Confederates in the 50s come into the lab and rate the length of lines, and they had to match one line with the correct length of three other lines. And they basically showed that around 70% of participants conformed to the incorrect majority at least once, who were all the participants were Confederates except for one. And I always think about this study, and of course there were multiple issues with the study and etc. But I reflect on this study and think, okay, but what if this is also the case now? How much did those participants within that study learn about their own susceptibility to wrong
Hmm.
influence? I'm sure that those individual participants who got it wrong multiple times would have reflected later on about, okay, that was like quite weird that I was influenced by others, or I said the wrong thing even though I knew it was wrong, or they led me to think that I was incorrect, etc. And yeah, I often reflect on like the power in learning by having it kind of happen to you accidentally and then reflecting on it later. So you feel like you learned something. It wasn't someone that told you directly what to change or what to do or how to evaluate something. You almost realized that you were influenced. And then that makes you reflect a bit more.
Yeah. I really like those studies too. I mean, when I talk about my interest in misinformation, I often cite the Solomon Asch studies as me finding interest in social influence and social psychology and how cool that was to learn that something as simple as reading lines that like I think it was like what 95 to 7% of the time people get it right on their own. It's like
Hmm. Hmm.
almost always you get it right if you're just by
Yeah.
yourself. But then if you
Yeah.
put a group of people in front of you that all give the wrong answer, then like you say 70% of the time you'll get something wrong. That was one of my first studies I ever did as an undergrad, just a class experiment. I made my own kind of Solomon Asch replication. And the spin I tried to do, I mean, I had all kinds of problems, but what I tried to do was I made these little images and then did the similar process of having a confederate lie about the images being the same or different. But then after the person gave the response, I had them actually deliberate with the confederate and try to like talk about why they, why they picked this or picked something else.
Yeah.
And it didn't quite work because I think the images that I made were basically like these like Microsoft Paint images of just like
Hmm.
squiggly lines, and they were so obviously wrong that it was kind of hard for my confederates, which was like my friends, to just be like, yeah, I think this is true. And it's like you can just point and be like, well, there's that line. Like this doesn't have a smiley face, but this does. Like, why do you not see that? And they're like, oh, I just don't see it. So that didn't quite work out, but that was my idea for trying to like have this deliberation process of, how social influence works. And it's funny because that
That's
was,
very cool.
yeah, so that was like when I was like a sophomore in college, but now I still think about that process today
Yeah,
of
yeah,
like,
yeah.
okay, like as you're describing, like what did you take away from this? Like what did you process on your own susceptibility to social influence? And can you identify that in the future? Or is this going to be like a one-off scenario? It's like, well, I was tricked that one time, but I'm not going to be tricked again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because that's actually also something that I've seen in my research is like when we ask people how susceptible they think they are to social influence
Hmm.
compared to how susceptible they think others are to social influence, there's a big discrepancy. So they think that others are much more likely to be affected by social influence than themselves.
Right.
So I think it is this thing that we don't think that we are the ones that are susceptible. It's all the others. And that's also the problem sometimes with misinformation interventions is like we want to send these games to other people that we know. Like,
Hmm.
you should play these games, you should learn about it without always necessarily properly reflecting on our own susceptibility. Yeah, and actually, coincidentally, that's also why we call the game Solomon's Secret because the main character is called Solomon Ash.
Yeah, that's funny. That's cool. I like that. I like that we have that same shared interest. I guess that makes sense given we've kind of explored similar things in our academic careers.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a cool game. Yeah, I'm looking forward to see what you find with it and how that expands, and hopefully it will be in every school throughout the world in a few years.
hopefully.
Hopefully. No pressure. So as you move forward, like with your research, is that kind of what you're one of the things you're focused on? Or I know you've also did a little bit of work with artificial intelligence, like meeting with different organizations, or is it all of the above? Like, are there certain areas of emphasis that you want to focus on moving forward?
Yeah, I think so. It's definitely an all of the above, but I also think like the impact of artificial intelligence and generative AI can't be ignored when we're studying misinformation. And yeah, so my current work is looking more at what happens when people uh, evaluate information that has been generated by AI, or if they just think that it has been generated by AI, or if it has been generated by a human but kind of changed or altered with AI, and how that impacts whether or not people believe it, how that impacts their perceptions of the source. So if the source is a human, using AI to kind of somehow like alter what they're saying, and also whether or not people are more likely to kind of be forgiving of AI altered information from in groups or out groups. Like, what is our threshold of acceptance for using generative AI in communication and information? Um, and I think it's a fascinating field to follow also because it's going so quickly with what people are researching and finding, and in relation to its impact on persuasion and how it is actually persuasive and the mechanisms through which it is persuasive. But then also, on the contrary, what it can be harnessed for. So, with chatbots sometimes being seen as more neutral than political outgroups, can be harnessed for democratic discourse and
Hmm.
used as a kind of neutral moderator, and people can be kind of trained to be less likely to believe conspiracy theories, and there are multiple kind of positives of it as well. But then, yeah, at the same time, research showing that it can persuade us to believe certain or to have certain political beliefs, and the more persuasive it becomes, bots often can become more persuasive by just giving more information and kind of being more information dense. But then research has shown this often can come at the cost of accuracy. So then the bots become more likely to also persuade you via misinformation. So everything's kind of intertwined with artificial intelligence, and I think it's really important to study. But at the same time, I won't like completely pivot my research to just look at that, because I think all the other elements are important to have in the picture as well.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think there is this natural overlap with studying how people process information and how different social forces impact their beliefs with artificial intelligence now that so many people are using it as a source of information. And we
Hmm.
don't, yeah, it's like we're just kind of trying to keep up as researchers of like, okay, well, how do people feel about this particular thing? And that thing might change pretty quickly.
Yeah, and also because the models are changing all the times.
Right.
uh, as soon as people are done kind of have studied one model, the model has been updated and and might be quite different. And there are so many different models, etc.
Yeah, it's a big challenge because, yeah, I know like there's this research on the overly agreeable chatbots.
Hmm.
But
Yeah,
now, like maybe that will change a year from now and like we won't see chatbots
exactly.
that are overly agreeable. So it's like, okay, well, if they are overly agreeable, we know that this could impact them.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, there's so much to look at. And still, one thing that is helpful is even just the general idea of how people feel about artificial intelligence, like a response from this generative AI thing, this large language model. Like, do people trust it
Hmm.
overall? And that's some of the work that I was doing a little bit as well, is just trying to look at how people broadly feel towards a Gen AI output versus, legacy news versus a person,
Hmm. Hmm.
and just try to understand like how people think about that. But what's so challenging is people's understandings and feelings towards AI could also shift.
Yeah.
Like as people were just learning about ChatGPT in like 2023, they might feel very differently about it in 2026. And
Yeah.
yeah, so it's
Yeah.
tough.
And also probably the more times that they have people have different experiences of realizing what it is providing inaccurate information. And the more times you have that experience, the more likely you might also be to not trust it. And also this element of authenticity, whether or
Hmm.
not authenticity is kind of part of judging someone or something or an entity as credible or not. Something I've also been thinking about is like in relation to synthetic identities and synthetic social engagement, as things become a bit harder to assess online, like whether likes are artificial, whether profiles are artificial, whether statements are artificial, whether or not that will impact the whether or not it will influence the impact of social engagement. So for example, the power of a like will
Hmm.
and the currency of these social cues, will it go down? But at the same time, coming from marketing, where with advertisements, we have always been aware when we're shown an advertisement, right? And we know that this is kind of artificially construed, and these people within the ad don't actually like that Coca-Cola necessarily, but they're
Hmm.
drinking it and they're
Yeah.
showing us that they love it and it's fake. But at the same time, even though we know these things, we're still impacted by ads in general. They can influence our attitudes. So that also makes me kind of question whether or not authenticity is necessary for
Hmm.
social engagement to kind of have an impact. I think that authenticity will and does matter, but I think the parallel with advertisement that we know is fake is kind of interesting, given that it can impact us anyway.
Right. And it also makes me think about the scalability of these Gen AI models and like even if it's a smaller effect than something a truly authentic human talking about how much they like a product or your social media post, if you get 1,000 AI agents to all like and say how great that is, that might have as much or more of an effect, and that's easy
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
create. And yeah, it is interesting, like with this research on the over agreeableness of how people. It seems like there's a pretty high threshold where if a chatbot's telling you how great you are, even if it's like over the top praise, you still kind of like it anyway, and you're like, "Oh, yeah."
Exactly. Of everyone thinking that they're above average, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah. So I guess I'm curious as how you see this. I know it's kind of hard to always talk about the future and what that will look like, but like what themes are you looking for as far as we go into this realm of artificial intelligence? Like what should people or researchers pay attention to? Are there things that make you feel optimistic or things that you're particularly worried about? Are there any like big themes that you hope more people dive into and are aware of at least?
Yeah, so I think on the positive side, I see kind of great potential for personalizing interventions and
Hmm.
personalizing things that work and things that can actually change beliefs and behavior in a positive way. So I think that that's really positive. Also, scaling things, scaling, for example, the interventions themselves, but also what people are exposed to within different interventions, that can really be fueled by artificial intelligence. I think something that worries me a little bit, though, from a research side is the idea of like AI monocropping and that everyone just pivots so quickly to AI that we all kind of lose foothold of our core disciplines and that everybody just pivots to studying AI, that it becomes like researchers studying AI, using AI, and then it becomes like the technology feeding its own growth,
Yeah.
where it's kind of this feedback loop of we start even sounding we all start sounding the same and talking about the same and people start investigating only hypotheses that are testable using artificial intelligence, etc., and kind of neglect that there's a whole human world out there that is not impacted by artificial intelligence. So that's kind of like a risk as I see with people pivoting too much and too deeply and too quickly into artificial intelligence. That said, I think it is a really powerful and concerning tool because it is such a powerful influence tool and because it is so easy to personalize messages, to scale them up, to reach specific audiences in ways that are just unprecedented. And left in the wrong hands, this can really kind of destabilize democracies. But that's also why I think at the same time, these tools must be harnessed for good. The kind of risk of not doing that, the kind
Right.
of bad actors or malicious actors are already doing it. And so we need a much better understanding of how to both I'm talking about these two sides, but like from the preventative side, harness these tools to also personalize interventions, but at the same time, really study what is the impact of these tools on influence systems and people's beliefs so that we can figure out where in the loop to kind of have our interventions.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. I think there's a lot of opportunity there despite a lot of the challenges and negative things that we see. I think that being able to scale education efforts is something that is pretty cool. I mean, there's an asymmetry among like even like funding and stuff like that as far as trying to promote education, media literacy and things of that nature. So if we can use AI to get that into more people, I think that's great. And with translation, personalization, things like that that are more technical, I think is another promising development.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree.
Yeah. So if people are interested in following your future work or your current work, where are you most active these days on the internet?
Probably on LinkedIn is where I post the most, and then on my website, which is slightly outdated and it needs to be updated. But I do post a lot on LinkedIn, having a happily left X behind.
Yeah, so did I. But yeah, I'll definitely put those links in the description of this show. And thank you so much for taking time to speak with me. I really enjoyed hearing about all of your thoughts about your research and everything that you've been working on lately. And yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing this with my listeners, and I'm sure they'll enjoy it as much as I did.
Thank you so much, Matthew. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you.